Wyoming Territory, September 1883. The wind was dry and biting when Yates Nolan kicked open the warped shed door and found her. The air inside was thick with dust and rot, and the only light came from a crack in the roof that painted a pale line across the dirt floor. She was lying there bound at the wrists and ankles with coarse rope, a dirty cloth tied tight around her mouth. Her eyes met his with raw fear, but there was something else too, defiance. She was not broken. Yates dropped to his knees beside her without a word. His hands worked fast, slicing through the rope with the blade he kept at his belt. She flinched when he pulled the gag free, coughing, her voice hoarse. "Water," she croaked. He eased a canteen to her lips, watching her drink, his brow furrowed. Her face was bruised, her lower lip split, but she was still breathing, still alive. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Nella," she said after a moment. "Nella Dorsey." Yates nodded. "You safe now? I'm taking you back to my place." Nella's eyes darted to the door. "Are they gone?" "I reckon so," he said. "That shack's been abandoned for weeks. Only reason I found you is because I came looking for a lost calf." She didn't say anything, just stared at the sunlight creeping across the floor like she wasn't sure it was real. Yates helped her to her feet. She winced, favoring her left leg, but she stood. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before lifting her into his arms. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Yates kept glancing at her, checking she had not passed out. She clung to his coat, her eyes closed, but her grip on the reins of his shirt was tight. The Nolan ranch sat in a narrow stretch of valley, tucked between the low hills and cottonwoods. The barn leaned with age and the house was small, but it was home, or had been once. He carried her inside and laid her on the sofa. His dog, a mutt with a crooked ear, sniffed the air and backed off with a whine, sensing something serious. "You got family I can wire." Nella shook her head slowly. "No one." Yates hesitated. "What happened to you?" She took a breath. "A man offered me work cooking for a trail crew. He said it paid well. I was desperate. My mother died in July and I had no coin left. I followed him out past Horseshoe Ridge. Then he and another man, they hit me. Took my bag, left me tied up in that shed." Yates's jaw clenched. "How long were you in there?" 3 days, maybe 4. I lost count." He stood and went to the stove, lit it, and started heating broth. She watched him, her eyes unreadable. "You live out here alone?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Used to be 5 of us, wife, 2 boys, my sister. Fever took them all last winter." Nella's voice softened. "I'm sorry," he shrugged, but his hands stilled for a beat before he kept stirring. "Had to keep the cattle going. Only thing I got left." She looked around the room. It was clean but spare, a man's house, built for work, not comfort. Still, there were small signs of what had been. A child's hand-drawn picture tacked to the wall, a faded shawl thrown over a chair. He brought her the broth and sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You can stay here until you're well." She met his gaze. "You sure? This ain't charity," he said. "You need shelter, I got it, that's all." She nodded. "Thank you." That night, she slept in the bed that once belonged to his sister. Yates sat by the fire, turning the events over in his mind. The way she had looked at him, not like a man to be feared, but like someone who mattered. It had been a long time since anyone looked at him like that. In the morning, she was still asleep. He left a note and rode to town, stopping first at the sheriff's office. "There's a woman," Yates said. "Her name's Nella Dorsey. Found her tied up in an old shed east of Horseshoe Ridge. Said 2 men did it." Sheriff Barlow narrowed his eyes. "You get names?" "No, but you better start asking around. She could have died out there." "I'll do what I can." Yates left without another word. Back at the ranch, Nella was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the hills. She looked better color in her cheeks, a little strength in her shoulders. "I fed the dog," she said when he dismounted. He gave a quiet nod. "Appreciate it. I can cook too. I just need a few things. You do not have to do anything." "I want to," she said. "I cannot stand sitting in that house waiting to feel useful." Yates ran a hand across his jaw. All right, I will take you into town tomorrow. Get what you need. She smiled, then a small thing, but real. That night, they sat on the porch after supper, the sky gone orange and purple. Crickets chirped, and the wind rustled the grass. She told him about growing up in Arkansas, about her mother's peach cobbler, and the way the river used to flood every spring. He told her about his boys. Gabe had liked to catch frogs, and Graham always lost his boots. His wife, Clara, had been quiet but strong. She had made the best coffee in the county. I buried them back behind the cottonwoods, he said. Put a fence around them. Keep the coyotes out. Neller reached over and touched his hand just for a second. I am glad you found me, she said. Yates looked at her, really looked at her. The bruises were fading. Her eyes were steady, and there it was again, that feeling deep in his chest. Like something was waking up after a long, cold sleep. I am too, he said. The wind picked up, and she leaned her head against the post. He stayed beside her, watching the stars come out, one by one. Neither of them said another word, but something between them had shifted, something real. And it was just beginning. The general store in Medicine Bow creaked and groaned under the weight of a late autumn wind, its porch boards worn soft from years of boot heels. Nella stepped down from the wagon, her skirt tugged sideways by the gust. She wrapped her shawl tighter, watching Yates tie the reins to the post with the same quiet care he showed everything. Inside, the store smelled of cloves and dried apples. The warmth from the potbelly stove a welcome change from the cold that had settled in her bones since the shed. She walked slow, not out of pain anymore, but because it felt strange to move freely through a place again. I'll get lard and coffee, Yates said. You take what you need. She nodded, moving toward the bolts of fabric near the back. Her fingers brushed a roll of blue calico, then lingered on a plain muslin. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She hadn't meant to pick out anything for herself. A voice startled her from behind. You're not from around here, she turned. A woman in an apron, older, hair pinned neat, studied her with a kind of quiet calculation. No, Nella said. Just come through. The woman's gaze softened. You with Mr. Nolan? Yes, ma'am. Good man, keeps to himself, but his word holds. Nella nodded, unsure what else to say. The woman glanced at the faint marks still healing on her face, then back to her eyes. If you ever need anything, you come find me. I'm Mabel. I run the counter most days. Thank you. By the time they left, the wagon bed held flour, salt, new socks, a kettle, and a flat tin box of buttons she hadn't asked for. Yates didn't mention it. He just helped her up and turned the team toward home. Halfway back, the wind died. The sun broke through a crack in the clouds, spilling gold across the yellowing grass. She leaned back, letting it warm her cheeks. You've been here long, she asked. 8 winters, Yates said. What did you do before? Worked cattle from Texas to Montana. Settled here when Clara wanted stable ground. Nella traced a stitch on her glove. I used to think I'd end up in St. Louis. They say the buildings there touch the sky. You still could. She looked at him. You think I'm meant for cities? He didn't answer right away. I think you're meant for more than what those bastards did to you. The words hit her like a clear bell rung in her chest. She looked back at the hills instead of his face. That night, after supper, she stood on the back step with her sleeves rolled. She was scrubbing the stew pot, not because she had to, but because her hands needed something to do. Yates joined her, carrying a lantern that threw long shadows across the packed earth. Sheriff had a name, he said. One of the men who hurt you, Gus Harlan. He's been seen near Rawlins. Her hands stilled on the tin basin. What happens if they find him? If they bring him in, there'll be a trial. If he draws on the wrong man, there won't be. I want to see his eyes when he answers for it. Yates met her gaze. You will. If that's what you need. She set the pot aside. You believe in justice. I believe in doing right by people who have had too much taken. She stepped closer, the lantern's glow catching the lines around his mouth. You ever think about starting again, not just surviving? Something more, he looked down. I wouldn't know how. You're already doing it, she said. You're feeding a stranger, fixing fences with a busted hand, and you haven't once asked for thanks. His voice was quieter. You're not a stranger now. Neither of them moved. The night had gone still, save for a single owl calling far off in the trees. She reached for his hand, just the edge of it, and he let her. Inside, the dog stirred in his sleep. The fire burned low. They stood there with fingers barely touching, two people who'd been stripped down to bone and still found something left to give. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You don't owe me anything, Nella." "I know," she said. "But I'd like to stay if it's all right." He gave the smallest nod. "Then you stay," he said, and the night wrapped around them not as a thing to fear, but as shelter. The first frost came before the leaves had fully turned, crisping the edges of the cottonwoods and dusting the pasture with silver. Yates rose before the light, same as always, but now the house held the small, quiet sounds of another life: footsteps on the floorboards, the scrape of a drawer, the faint hum of someone thinking aloud in the kitchen. Nella was kneading biscuit dough when he stepped inside from the barn, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied up with a faded ribbon that hadn't been there yesterday. "You're up early," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Couldn't sleep," she said without looking up. "Dreams keep tangling me up." He took the coffee pot off the hook and poured her a cup, setting it on the table beside her. "You remember anything new?" "A smell," she said. "Pine tar and sweat." One of them wore a vest lined with rabbit fur. She pressed her palms into the dough, slow and methodical. "I remember the sound he made when he laughed like a saw through ice." Yates nodded once. "Sheriff wired west of Rawlins. Harlan's cousin runs a freight outfit near Elk Mountain. They're watching the road." She leaned back, wiping flour onto her apron. "I don't want to live bitter." "You're not bitter." "I'm trying not to be." She looked at him then. "But I want to build something that doesn't start with fear." He picked up the tin of coffee and refilled his cup, letting the silence stretch while she shaped the dough into rounds. "You ever keep chickens?" he asked. She blinked. "Once, when I was little." "Why?" "I got an empty coop and no eggs. Figured if you're gonna stay, you ought to have a say in what this place becomes." She smiled, not out of politeness, but slow and genuine, like it came from somewhere she hadn't touched in a long while. "Well," she said, "I like that idea." That afternoon, Yates hitched the wagon and they rode north to the Laramie crossing, where a homesteader named Redman had posted a sign offering hens for barter. The air smelled of singed grass and horses, and the road was rough with frozen ruts. Nella sat with her ankles crossed, holding the empty crate between her boots. "You ever miss it?" she asked as they rounded a bend. "The trail, sleeping under stars, moving day to day." He shrugged. "I miss riding with men I trusted. I don't miss burying half of 'em." They passed a stand of quaking aspen, the leaves pale and trembling. She turned to him. "What made you stay here after they passed?" Clara wanted the boys to know stillness. "I couldn't give her much, but I could give her that." She looked down at her hands. "I never stayed anywhere long. Mama was always moving us to chase work. I got used to leaving before anyone could miss me. I reckon that's a hard way to grow." "I didn't know different," she said, "but I think I'm learning now." They bought 6 hens and a cranky rooster, all feather and noise. On the way back, the wagon rocked with their complaints, and Nella laughed a surprised, rusted sound that startled even her. Yates glanced over, his face unreadable, but something in his chest loosened. Back at the ranch, they set the birds in the coop while the wind tossed dry leaves against the fence posts. Nella crouched to check the nesting boxes, brushing hay into the corners. "These'll do," she said. "Give 'em 2 days and they'll settle." He leaned on the gate, arms folded. "You know what you're doing." "Mama taught me what she could," she said, standing. "The rest I figured out hungry." He didn't answer, just reached up and latched the gate behind her. She turned toward the house, and he fell in step beside her. Inside, she peeled off her gloves and laid them on the windowsill. The kettle hissed on the stove, and the scent of dried mint hung in the air from the bundle she'd tied near the chimney. "Your hand's all right?" he asked. "Little raw," she said, flexing her fingers, "but it feels good to work." "I need the ache. Reminds me I'm not helpless." He nodded, then stepped closer, his voice lower. "I know what it is to feel useless, Nella. After Clara passed, I walked through days like I didn't have skin, just bones and breath." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "What pulled you through?" "Time," he said. "And the cattle, they needed feed no matter how I felt." She reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve. "You've got a way of saying things like they're carved in stone." He looked down at her hand, then back to her face. "I don't know how to be any other way." "I don't want you to." The kettle rattled and whistled, but neither moved. Her thumb brushed the seam of his shirt. He lifted a hand and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, slow and careful, like she might vanish if he moved too fast. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm not afraid," she said, and he believed her. That night she stood at the window while he banked the fire. The stars burned cold above the hills, and the chickens rustled in the dark. She turned, and he was watching her. She crossed the room and took his hand without asking. He didn't let go. The wagon rested beneath the shed roof, its wheels mudded from a trip to the far pasture. Nella sat on the porch steps, darning a tear in one of Yates's sleeves by the last of the afternoon light. Her stitches were neat, sure. She hadn't sewn much since her mother passed, but the motion steadied her, gave the hours shape. Yates was in the lean-to, oiling the gate hinges. She could hear the rasp of the cloth, the creak of the wood shifting under his weight. It comforted her, the way he moved through his chores with quiet rhythm, never hurrying, never wasting. She finished the last stitch, tied it off, and folded the shirt across her lap. When he came up the path, she stood and offered it to him. "You do this for every man who finds you in a ruin?" he asked, one brow raised. "I do it for the one who gave me a bed and never asked what I'd done to deserve it," she said. He took the shirt, eyes on the seam. "You got a steady hand." "I had to learn early. My mother hated waste." Said a frayed hem was a shame on the household. "She teach you to ride too," only bareback, and only when she had something better to do than notice. Her voice was dry, but not bitter. "I could stay on a horse before I could write my own name. Seems like anything you set your hands to, you get done." She brushed her palms together. "I don't know how to sit still long, makes the inside of my head too loud." His gaze held hers for a beat. "You don't seem like a woman who lets the noise win." "I don't," she said. "Not anymore." They ate supper in the kitchen, the lamp throwing a warm pool of light across the table. She'd made a stew from the last of the salt pork, and what potatoes hadn't gone soft. He didn't say anything while they ate, but he kept glancing at her hands, the way she cradled her spoon, the way she reached for the salt with the back of her fingers. After they'd cleared the dishes, he brought out a small wooden box from the cupboard. He set it on the table and opened it to reveal a scatter of letters, yellowed and folded, tied with a strip of cloth. "These were Clara's," he said. "She wrote to her sister in Kansas. Most of 'em never got sent." Nella looked up at him. "Why show me?" "Because you're the first person I've wanted to share 'em with, and I think Clara would want you to read her words." She touched the edge of the paper gently. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She unfolded one and read a few lines in silence. They were tender letters, full of small things, how the creek had flooded, how the boys had made a game of catching crickets in the yard. She blinked slowly, then folded it again and tucked it back into the box. "She loved it here," Nella said. She did. She rested her hand on the lid. "You've kept her alive in your way." "I tried." She looked at him across the table. "I don't want to take her place. I couldn't." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to. I just want you to make your own place here." She stood then, slow and certain, and came around the table. Her hand found his shoulder, stayed there. "You think there's room in this house for something new, Yates?" He reached up, covered her hand with his. "I do." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the grass with a low hush. The lamp flickered once but held steady. They stood together in the quiet, fingers entwined, neither needing to speak. Later, when they lay in their separate rooms, the hush of the wind still moving through the eaves, both would think of the same thing. Not what they'd lost, but what might be growing now, slow and real, like the first green shoot breaking through hard dirt. The snow came early that year, dry and powder fine, settling over the Nolan ranch like breath held too long. It softened the lines of the fence posts, blanketed the chicken coop, and dusted the porch rails where Nella leaned with a shawl draped over her shoulders, watching the whites of the land blend into the sky. Yates stepped out behind her, boots crunching softly. He carried 2 mugs, steam rising in quiet spirals. "You don't have to be out here," he said, handing her one. "I like the way the world hushes when it snows," she answered. "Makes it easier to think." He leaned against the post beside her, eyes on the pasture. "You thinking about Harlan?" She shook her head. "Not today. Sheriff wired last week said he'd crossed into Colorado territory. That's far enough to let it rest." Yates nodded but didn't speak. Nella sipped her drink. "I ain't forgettin'. But I'm done letting him sit at my table, even in thought." He looked over at her, a slow respect in his eyes. "You're stronger than you know." "I'm learning that," she said. "And I'm learning this place suits me." They stood in companionable stillness while the snow ticked softly on the porch roof. In the barn, the horses shifted, warm breath rising in clouds. The chickens had settled early, tucked into straw like old women in quilts. "I was thinking," she said, "that small room off the kitchen, your sister's sewing room. We could clear it out and build shelves. Be a good place for drying herbs come spring." He nodded. "We can do that. And if you've still got the plow blades, I can help you turn the soil behind the coop. It's rich there. Could get beans in before frost next fall. You want to stay through harvest." She turned to him. "I already stayed through winter." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quiet as breath, "You ever think about marrying again?" She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I thought about it every time I set a place for you at supper." Yates's mouth softened. "I never asked because I didn't want to bind you to a broken man." "You're not broken, Yates. You're weathered. There's a difference." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers like asking permission. When she didn't pull away, he wrapped them fully around hers. "I've got no ring," he said, "but I've got a house with a solid roof, 2 milk cows, and enough land to raise a family if that's the road we take." Her eyes glistened, but didn't fall. "What I want is a life where I wake up knowing someone's beside me who sees me, not just what's happened to me." He brought her hand to his chest. "Then let's build that life." They married in early March, with the thaw just beginning. Sheriff Barlow came out to stand witness, and Mabel from the store brought bread and a pie. Nella wore her mother's brooch at her collar, and Yates shaved for the first time in months, his jaw newly sharp beneath the stubble. They said their vows under the cottonwoods, the ones Yates had fenced in years ago. The grave stood quiet nearby, marked and remembered, but no longer holding all his heart. After the small gathering left, they walked the pasture hand in hand, boots sinking into the softening earth. "I never had a wedding before," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "Clara and I jumped the broom at a trail camp. Wasn't much more than a promise and a stew pot." She squeezed his hand. "This feels like something planted deep." "It is." In the months that followed, the ranch changed in small, steady ways. The sewing room became a pantry hung with bundles of sage and wild mint. The garden behind the coop rose green and lush. In May, Nella found herself humming while she kneaded bread, a tune she didn't know she remembered. Yates built her a rocker from old fence rails, and she kept it on the porch. Most evenings, they sat together there, watching the light fall across the hills. She would read aloud sometimes, letters from Clara or passages from a book Mabel lent them. He'd listen with his eyes half closed, not from tiredness, but peace. One morning in July, she stepped out into the yard, barefoot in the grass, and called softly for him. He came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. She held up a folded scrap of cloth. "I think I'm carrying." He crossed the distance to her and laid a hand gently over hers, then on her belly. "You sure? I'm late, and I feel different." Like the ground shifted under me in some quiet way. He looked at her, his eyes full of something deep and wide. "Then we'll make room, always." That night he carved a second cradle rail. Years passed, marked not by loss, but by harvests, by birthdays, by the slow addition of joy. Their child, a girl with Nella's eyes and Yates's quiet way, grew up chasing chickens and asking too many questions at the supper table. She learned to ride bareback before she could spell her name, and every night she fell asleep beneath a quilt stitched from old shirts and new beginnings. The Nalan ranch was never large, never rich, but it was steady and full. And in all the places where silence had once held grief, it now held laughter, the creak of the rocker, the scrape of a hoe in tilled earth, and the low murmur of voices in the evening, two people still choosing each other every day in every season.